Well, it's UCF's first big test of the season, heading to Fort Worth to take on TCU. Do the Knights have it in them to get their first Big 12 win on the season? Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Charge On. As always, I am your host, Sean Green. Before we get started, let's hear a word from our sponsor, Bet Online. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200K. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet Online, the game starts here. Nick Geddes joins me as always. Big week. UCF is 2-0. It was once again a long Saturday for us. But we got through it. We want to thank everybody, as always, for continuing to support us through the season. We've got a lot more content coming. Before we get into TCU, just want to throw out there, we are doing a live watch-along on the channel. So if you want to come watch the game with me, give your comments live as the game is happening. We'll be doing the whole game. So come on, hang out, and watch the game with me. Nick, UCF's 2-0. We talked ad nauseum about it on Saturday, but we also know that this has always been the game. This is the game that really is going to kind of define the early part of your year. You've got some tough games after TCU. It's a long season, but this is the game everybody's got circled as to, is this team actually legit or not? But how are you doing, and how excited are you to see this matchup finally?
Doing great. It feels like this is like the real start to the season. With all respect to New Hampshire and Sam Houston State, it doesn't hit the same as looking at the schedule ahead and seeing TCU coming up. And it's far from the same TCU team that we saw that was playing in the national championship 18 months ago. It's hard to believe that. The roster is probably a shell of what it was then, but I think it's still, all things considered, a very quality opponent. The betting information has been very interesting on this game, watching that line go back and forth. So pretty much telling you that Vegas views it as a pretty even matchup. Sold out crowd in TCU. I know that you've said a lot. It doesn't seem like it's one of the more raucous environments in the Big 12, but I think it's definitely going to be on Saturday night.
Yeah, you talked about the betting lines. We record our previews on Tuesday. We get it done early. We get it to you guys by Thursday. Yesterday, the line was TCU favored by 2. There were some sites that had it TCU favored by 1.5. Just in a day, that line has completely moved into UCF's favor. As of this recording, UCF on some sites is favored by 2.5. On Bet Online, they're favored by 2. And on others, it's 1.5. So the line has completely shifted to UCF. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. I assume TCU would have been favored the entire week, given it. We'll talk through TCU and kind of give you our thoughts on the team and how we see this matchup. But by the public's view, a very even matchup, and usually when it's an even matchup, a toss-up, if you will, it goes to the home team in terms of Vegas line. So that's definitely interesting. And also to your point about the home crowd, I think, and we'll get into, it kind of goes along with predictions and how we think a team will do on the road. As we know, UCF has not done well on the road. TCU, in terms of the Big 12, no offense to the Horned Frogs, we love them. Their home atmosphere is, in my opinion, on the bottom scale, kind of in the middle to the bottom scale in the Big 12. So for UCF, for their first road game, much more positive to have that as your first one than having to go to Ames in week 3, Nick. So, you ready to get into it? Did you do your homework on TCU? This was a fun preview week. This was a fun homework week for us.
Yeah, I'm got my homework right in front of me. I know you got a lot to bring to the table, so let's do this.
Let's do it. Head coach Sonny Dykes. Don't want to bring this up, and I didn't bring it up to Gus like this, Nick, at the presser this week. We've seen head coach Sonny Dykes. He was the head coach at SMU before he went over to TCU. UCF, granted, this was in 2021 where there was a lot of injuries on the UCF roster. We had a true freshman quarterback in because that was the year Dylan Gabriel got hurt. But We went on the road to SMU, and Sonny Dykes gave UCF and Gus Malzahn a 55-28 loss. A very different team. Mark Anthony Richards was the starting running back that day, so that name kind of brings up memories. So that is just a little nugget about Sonny Dykes, but obviously TCU went to the national championship just 2 seasons ago. Last year went 5-7, and they've started against Stanford, beating them 34-27, and then Long Island University, which, Nick, I don't know if you knew that was a school, just like I don't think we knew New Hampshire was a school.
Well, my family happens to be, or dad's side of the family happens to be from the Long Island area, so I did know it was a school just because of that.
So you're probably one of the only people that knew that was a school.
Now, I did not know they had a football team. Let me make that distinction.
So then you join the rest of America who also didn't know that was a football team.
Correct.
Talk about Sonny Dykes. Obviously, listen, he had a rocky start in his head coaching career going to Cal. It wasn't as bad as people made it to be, but wasn't great. Had really good teams at SMU before Rhett Lashley brought Rhett Lashley in to really teach him kind of the Gus Malzahn running attack. And then he got the job at TCU and has done great things there already. But kind of talk about Sonny Dykes and the challenges he presents as a head coach.
Yeah, clearly he's one of the more accomplished head coaches in the Big 12 by virtue of just being in the national championship 2 years ago. And I think sort of the challenge with him right now and with TCU is how do you rebuild this thing? It's very hard in the modern day to sort of, unless you're like the big dogs, right? And we all know who they are, that just recruit at the highest level and they're able to have sustained success year in and year out. I think when you come out of nowhere like TCU did, it's very hard to sustain that level of success. And I think you saw that last year when you lose a Max Duggan, when you lose a Condre Miller, you lose a Quentin Johnston, and on and on and on. What are you going to be after that? And you saw last year TCU, I believe, was a 5-win football team last year. But I think there are some encouraging signs. Sonny Dykes has done really well on the recruiting trail. I mean, they're very similar to UCF. Like when you look at where both programs are from a recruiting standpoint at the moment, I don't think there's much differentiating them. And what's really going in his favor right now and in TCU's favor is I think they found the quarterback, Sean. I think they have found the quarterback. Josh Huber, after a very impressive freshman stint last year, I think so far through 2 games, I think that's carried over to this year. I think there's some other positions that could use some strengthening, but I think they are on the rise. It's just a matter of how quickly are they going to rebuild this thing.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, listen, they went to a national championship. They got smacked in the national championship. I don't think really that matters. At the end of the day, you got there. Right. There's a reason you got there. I think prolonged success is what everybody's looking for. You don't just want to get to a national championship and then fall off. TCU had a rough second year right after that, but now they're trying to rebuild it. They're trying to get back into it. Some of it's through the transfer portal. Some of it's just trying to build, through the freshman classes. But as we go through, you'll kind of see how TCU is really building that team. And you talked about it, Josh Hoover, committed to TCU, sophomore, I believe, redshirt sophomore. You said that he had a good freshman campaign. I think it was up and down. He wasn't the starter going into the year. Didn't take until week 6 to throw him in there against Iowa State. Clearly something wasn't working. Gets thrown in against Iowa State. He went 2-4. And listen, it's a different TCU team. There's similarities, but they've lost some guys. They brought in some guys. He went 2-4 as a starter. He's now 4-4 as a starter as a whole. The big issue last year, Nick, when he was starting, was interceptions. Now, as he threw 15 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, threw 2,200 yards, 62.1%.
They had to throw a lot. They had to throw a lot last year.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into the running game that they have this year and stuff like that. Seems like a very similar type of team in terms of having to throw the football. The difference, though, this year is he's not making those same mistakes. Now, it's only 2 games of small sample size. He has had a lot of time in the pocket against Stanford and Long Island. But what have you seen out of Josh Hoover? What's the difference? Is it just another year under his belt? He's only technically, in his career, started 8 games, not even a full season yet. So, what have you seen in those differences against Stanford and Long Island to say he's taken a little bit of a jump where he could be really hard to defend?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of mentioned it like last year, he kind of went through some of those growing pains. And I mean, listen, when you're a freshman, it's kind of just thrown into the fire last year. And I think his first start came on the road against BYU. And BYU, not a great football team. It's still a pretty tough environment to get into. And I thought you saw against Stanford. And again, Stanford probably going to be in the bottom of the ACC by the end of the year, if you probably had to guess. So it's not the greatest form of competition, but it's still a true road game at a conference, first game of the season. And I think it's important to remember TCU was behind in that game for most of it. And then I thought he had a really strong third quarter in that football game. I was looking at some of the throws that he made, a lot of it over the middle. So he's not scared to throw over to the middle. There's no doubt about that. I think the TCU skill room around him is a little bit more improved than it was last year. So that's helped him. He has not put the ball in harm's way, which has been good. And, you know, even with those sort of freshman mistakes that he made last year, like, I think it's important to note, and I know numbers sometimes are numbers and they all have, some of them come without context, but like of the returning starting quarterbacks from last year to this year, I think he was ranked 10th in QBR, in total QBR from last year coming into this year. And like, just to put that in perspective, Quinn Ewers was number 8 on that list. And everybody, you know, thinks of Quinn Ewers, and rightfully so, as one of the best quarterbacks in college football. I'm not saying that's Josh Hoover. I'm not saying that whatsoever. And again, numbers are numbers. But I think there was a lot to build off there from what he did last year. And I think that has carried over to this season. And I think if you look at this TCU team and this roster, I don't think he's one of those guys that you look at and go, oh, he's an issue. I think he's absolutely a strength, and he's one of the more underrated quarterbacks that we have in this conference.
Yeah, he can throw the ball. I mean, if you give him time in the pocket, he's going to deliver the ball to his playmakers. And I think when you look at TCU, and again, we're about to talk about the running game, it's kind of non-existent. They have a running back, obviously. They have a running game.
That's good to know. They have a running back. That's good to know.
Obviously. But the running game is semi-non-existent. They have not run the ball well in the first 2 games of the season. They are throwing the football. They are throwing it there, making Josh Hoover throw it. And credit to the offensive line. They've done a good job of protecting him. He hasn't really had to make crazy throws or put balls in positions where, you know, the defense can get it. He also hasn't played really a defense that you can assume is going to cause turnovers or create turnovers. So we'll see. We'll see what he can do. His completion percentage has gone up, and I know you mentioned the QBR. I know QBR for a lot of people, some people love it, some people hate it. I think it is a good metric to look at sometimes with quarterbacks. But he's throwing 71.6% completion percentage this season. So he's definitely taken a step up, and I think Kendall Briles has helped. Kendall Briles, obviously, is the new offensive coordinator, was the offensive coordinator for KJ Jefferson in Arkansas, which that's a whole other conversation that we can get into. But KJ knows Kendall. Kendall knows KJ. I think both can tell Gus Malzahn and Sonny Dykes a little bit about each other. But let's move on to the running game, Nick, because the running game, you know, TCU's always been a really pass-heavy team. That's, you know, Sonny Dykes, he's an air raid guy. He likes to pass the football around. And I mentioned he brought in Rhett Lashley at SMU to kind of teach him or show him the Gus Malzahn run scheme, to show how you can kind of incorporate running backs more into an offense. Hasn't really shown up this year. I mean, you have Cam Cook, who's their clear-cut number one. He's got 33 carries for 139 yards and 4 touchdowns. And again, he had 3 touchdowns against Long Island. And his stats against Long Island weren't that impressive. I think it was like 13 carries for 58 yards or something like that. But then you go down the list, and they've got 3 other running backs they play. They just don't have a lot of depth there. They're trying to get other guys opportunities, but if you look, the other 3 guys combined don't even hit 100 yards. So kind of talk about the running game a little bit, and what do you see out of the TCU running game so far?
I mean, it's clearly not anything they lean on. I think that's for sure. But I think if TCU is going to take that next level, obviously, I think throwing 40 plus times a game is probably not going to be sustainable. And like, they have had sort of a balance. Like, even in that TCU game, I think they threw 42 times and they ran 34 times, but 3.1 yards per carry. Now, I think Cam Cook had 20 for 81 in that game, which is not too bad. Not too bad. You know, you sort of question the offensive line I think, a little bit. And I think that's something that Sonny Dykes was speaking about after this Long Island game, is that they need to clean it up in the run game and everything. And like they feel like they've excelled in pass protection, but in terms of running the football, I don't think they've gotten the push that they would like from their offensive line. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. And it's probably one of my matchups that I'm looking at here is the UCF defensive line, which I think we would agree is, on paper, even without John Walker, I think it's still a strength of this football team and of this defense. And I don't think the offensive line for TCU is necessarily one of their strengths. So could be something for UCF to exploit. I do imagine like this is going to be one of those. I think it's going to be a fun football game. First, I think it has the potential to be a really, really fun sort of throwback Big 12 football game. And I think you probably will still see TCU continue to try to throw the ball through the air.
No, and I think if you're UCF and you're Ted Roof, it was funny, Trace Trellcliff, sons of UCF, asked him, like, are you happy right now with your defense? And he goes, no, I'm not happy. Like, and it was just this funny thing, like, yeah, we haven't done anything. You're going up against a real opponent this week, and if I was Ted Roof, just like if you put your mind in the head of Andy Avalos, and we'll get to the defense here in a second, but what do you think TCU is going to want to do offensively? They're going to want to pass the football. So ultimately, you don't want to have to rush. You don't want to have to blitz. You don't want to have to send a lot of pressure. You want to, play deep, and you want to play the pass all the time. So I think the big question mark is, can UCF's defensive line with a 4-man front get pressure on Josh Hoover and force him to make some errant throws to where UCF can get some turnovers? But let's talk about some of the receivers that some of those corners are going to be playing. They return 2 of their top 3. They've lost a couple guys. I mean, they lost their top running back. They lost Jared Wiley, who was their tight end, to the NFL. He's with the Chiefs now. But they're returning their top guy, Savion Williams, and he's already had, a good year so far. 16 receptions, 154 yards, and a touchdown. He had his biggest year last year, Nick. 41 receptions, 573 yards, and 4 touchdowns. They've got some guys, though. Talk about kind of their receivers. You got like J.P. Richardson and then Beck. Talk about their receiving core. It's dangerous, but they've got 3 guys. It seems like they've got 3 guys right now, and then there's just a bunch of, fill-ins, which Hoover gets them the ball, but talk about those guys.
Yeah, I think it's a very underrated sort of 3 set of receivers, just focusing on those 3. Savion Williams, obviously over 500 yards last year. He was going to be probably the number 1 option this year, and he has been that. But I think the other 2 guys behind him has been a pleasant surprise for TCU, and both are transfers, second year in the programs type transfers. Jack Beck, he was the LSU transfer, and J.P. Richardson comes from Oklahoma State. And if you look at Beck in particular, he's already topped his 2023 production in 2 games with TCU. And you go back to that Stanford game, Beck and Richardson, they were the first 2 TCU receivers to have 100 yards in the same game since Darius Davis and Quentin Johnston did that in 2020. And last time I checked, both those guys are playing in the NFL. So that just puts into perspective, I think, how key that Beck and Richardson have been for TCU, and it gives them a nice stable of receivers. Like you had mentioned, I mean, Wiley was a really, really good tight end last year for this team. There's a reason why he got drafted. I believe he's in Kansas City right now, if I'm not mistaken, in the NFL. So you're still replacing the production of him, but I think you have to be pleased if you're TCU that you've seen the emergence of Beck and Richardson to complement Savion Williams. And like I said, I think it's a very underrated sort of trio of receivers that they can bring at you. And it's really going to be the first big test for that secondary at UCF, because we knew New Hampshire wasn't going to test them at all. I know you had your sort of issues late in the game with Sam Houston.
Not just late the game, but
it was late in the game, and you were overreacting. But but we're gonna find out in this one, because TCU is going to play to their strengths. I think we know that. So the UCF secondary is going to be tested in this one.
Yeah, it's going to take everybody. I mean, again, when we talk about Josh Hoover, he's going to throw the football a lot. He's going to get it to them. I mean, Williams is a deep threat, but again, they're just going to throw it to him a bunch. They're going to give their guys opportunities. Beck and Richardson are more, again, deep threat type of guys. You're going to get about 20 yards a catch on a lot of those throws, and Hoover's going to give them opportunities. So it's going to be, are you good with your fundamentals? Are you confident in your ability after the fall to really key in on your fundamentals and make sure these guys don't break out for long passes, because last year with Addison Williams, that was a positive. There wasn't a lot of deep throws. There wasn't a lot of big chunk plays besides the run game. It was the corners played really solid. So you really have to feel confident if UCF can do something similar but stop the run game. You have to feel a little bit confident in their ability to maybe not stop TCU, but to be able to hold them off and get some stops. Let's move on to the defense, because I think that's basically the offense in a nutshell. Their offensive line, we didn't get into it too much, but we talked about with the run game. It's not, I think, playing against Kansas State last year compared to a TCU in your opener, offensive line's not as good as what Kansas State had. I think we looked at Kansas State last year, their offensive line, the first game, like, okay, there's a little bit of a discrepancy here with what we're used to. I think they can really match up well against TCU on that front. But let's go to the defense, because good old Andy Avalos, man. We can't get rid of him. It's like we play him, this is now 3 out of 4 years with Gus Malzahn that we're playing Andy Avalos. I don't like playing him. He gives UCF fits. And I actually, Gus mentioned it. He played Andy against Oregon when he was at Auburn. He played him when he was at Oregon. And they won on a last-second touchdown to win 27-21 when he had Bo Nix and they played Justin Herbert in 2019. So a little while back. But clearly Andy Avalos gives Gus fits. The first game, it was 36-31. So UCF scored. But if you also remember that game, UCF was getting their butt kicked for 40 minutes or something. Then last year, the 18-16 victory, which was a nail-biter, and you had to make a last-second field goal to get out of there. So maybe not the most... I wouldn't say this defense, Nick, is elite after watching them. I think they can be leaky. Their defensive line isn't as solid as probably what we'll see later on in the year. But when you have a DC like Andy Avalos, who knows UCF, who's played them a bunch of times, it does create some cause for concern, no?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. But, I mean, I still feel pretty confident about UCF's ability to move the football against any team that they play. And I don't think this TCU defense is necessarily great. I think they have some individual standouts, but as a collective, I don't think they're a great football team. I do think that they have a chance. Like, I think one of their better defensive players, Paul Ayawale, I think Sonny Dykes said today that he has a chance to play in this football game. I think he said they're optimistic he has a chance to come back. So that should absolutely help them. The big matchup here is UCF's run game versus the front seven of TCU. And TCU, one of the more underrated linebacker sort of tandems in the country, honestly. Not just the Big 12, I think in the country, with Johnny Hodges and Nnamdi Obiazor. And Obiazor was a beast last week against Long Island. 1.5 sacks, first career interception, 9 tackles. He sort of does it all for them. Hodges, I think, is the same thing as well. So it's going to be a big matchup. I mean, I've heard them talking about how the UCF offense is going to be one of the biggest challenges they sort of face all season long. So that certainly, I think they're on their radar, but it'd be interesting to see how UCF sort of goes into this with that running back rotation. I think we've talked a lot about that. When you get into some of these games, are we going to see more of a full load for RJ Harvey, or are we going to continue to see, the split that we've seen to sort of keep him fresh? I think that's what I'm sort of really zoning in on in this football game, is how they're going to treat that. But I think absolutely, I mean, for the number one rushing team in the nation right now, averaging 419 yards per game, I believe it is. It's just like, that's beyond video. I've never done that in a video game, Sean. I mean, that's beyond video game, and they're doing it in real life. I know TCU is expecting them, but that is 100%, I think, UCF's path to victory is continuing to lean on that run game.
No, for sure. And this is the perfect opportunity to talk about the UCF offense. Listen, they're going to have to score points. They're on the road. That's what you have to do, especially against some of these Big 12 teams that, listen, the defense isn't, I don't want to say isn't anything special. They're not as good as some of the defenses we faced last year. They've got some talented pieces. You mentioned the linebackers, and I 100% agree. You have to make sure you know where those guys are at all times. if we are in the minds of Andy Avalos, right? If you were in the minds not just of him, but of most Big 12 teams as of right now, if we were TCU and we're playing UCF in week 1, listen, you got vanilla offense 2 weeks by UCF. You're watching film. There's nothing crazy you're seeing on tape with UCF. But they are the number 1 rushing offense in the nation. We talked about it, Nick, after the first game, that you have to put something on film with KJ Jefferson throwing the football to make defenses respected. Am I off for thinking that, to be completely honest, I think TCU's just going to load. They don't care about last week, which they shouldn't. It wasn't a hard opponent in Sam Houston. Am I wrong for thinking they're probably going to load the box early and dare UCF to just, hey, let's see if you can run it on us with 8 in the box, and let's dare KJ to throw? Because I think if it wasn't TCU, if it was Colorado, if it was Iowa State, whoever had UCF week 1 after these past 2 weeks, you don't really know much, but you know they can run the football, so they're going to try and stop it quick. Am I wrong to think that?
No, I don't think you are at all. I mean, I've never coached football, and I absolutely could never. But if I was if you gave me the reins to this whole operation and said, how are we gonna stop UCF or at least limit them? I don't think you can necessarily stop them, but how are we going to limit them? You got to do everything you can to load the box and force KJ Jefferson to beat you. I think after 2 games, and listen, week 2 was a huge improvement over what we saw in week 1. I think he was number 1 graded passer in the conference for PFF this week. And he did that only throwing the ball 15 times. And I've talked a lot about that when you get into some of these conference games, I don't know if you can get away with throwing 14 and 15 times a game. And I know that a lot of that had to do with the opponents you were playing last week. You really didn't have to air it out in those moments. But last week when he was called upon, I thought he answered the bell very well. But if you're TCU, I think you still probably view him as the weak link of that. I mean, is that fair to say? You probably still view KJ as the big question mark on the offense at the moment. And like the way I look at it, I don't think UCF's going to run for 400 yards in this game. I think they could prove me wrong, and we'd be having a totally different discussion after this, but I don't think they're going to be running for 400 yards. And I think if you're TCU, if you can try to keep UCF as an offense in total under 200 rushing yards, you got to feel very confident about your chance to win that football game. I think that's got to be the emphasis for them.
Yeah, I think if they hold UCF to under 200 rushing yards, UCF loses this game.
Yeah, I think that's the number.
Yeah, and I think you've formed an identity. UCF has, for better or worse, the identity for UCF football this year is going to be hard-nosed, running the football down your throat, and hoping and praying that as a defense we could stop it. Now, granted, KJ is going to have to throw the football. We've talked about that. I think Kendall Briles knows KJ, knows what his weaknesses are. I think TCU is going to try and do whatever they can to throw him off. I think KJ is going to run the football. He's going to have to, in my opinion, just to keep them honest. But it's going to be up to the receivers. It's going to be up to KJ. You're going to have to prove, because here's the thing. I think if the defense can get a couple stops, and we're not giving predictions yet, but if you can get some stops on a pass-heavy offense, the clock's not going to be running. Like, what's been the recipe for beating UCF? It's controlling the clock, keeping the ball on offense, limiting UCF's opportunities. When you look at TCU, I don't want to say they're very similar to UCF in terms of offense, except they just aren't good at running the football. They don't really care about controlling the clock. They're throwing the football all around the field. They're not trying to, play keep away like most teams are with UCF. So these teams are very similar. And if UCF is just going to run all over them and you get a couple 3-and-outs, it can get ugly. I don't think it's going to get ugly, but with the way TCU plays, if they're not efficient and UCF defense is as good as we hope it is, I think it can get ugly early with how good UCF can play. But to your point, if you can't run for more than 200 yards, then it's probably going to be a long day for UCF, in my opinion. But who knows? KJ might throw for 300 yards and run all over them. But let's talk a little bit about the team rankings. I do have a stat with their kicker, but I might mention that for our predictions.
Ooh, a kicker stat. Interesting.
Yeah, I do have their kicker.
I love kicker. I love kicker talk.
I know you do. That's why I knew when I wrote it down, I'm like, Nick's going to love this. Want to emphasize that these are the first 2 weeks for team rankings. So these are skewed. UCF played New Hampshire and Sam Houston. So again, like for example, their total defense is 19th in the country. We don't really know if their defense is 19th in the country. But I think there was a couple interesting things, Nick. TCU's total offense, UCF is third. They're 46th. They did play Stanford. And I think the only reason we're giving any credit to it is because it is a Power 4 opponent. Stanford is probably one of the worst Power 4 teams you could play, but there's still something to note there. Now, they are 46 in total offense, but we talked about their rushing offense and passing offense, and this is what I want to get your take. The rushing offense, or let's go their passing. Their passing offense is 37th in the country, I believe, right? If I'm not mistaken. I write horribly. Passing offense is 16th in the country in passing offense. Rushing is 100th. So they are, when we were talking about one of the worst things about them is their rushing offense. 100th in rushing offense doesn't do you much help. For example, Sam Houston is 96th in rushing offense. So you're seeing, in terms of, I guess, the first 2 weeks, a very similar team in terms of running the football. And we talked about how this is a very similar team to Sam Houston, the way they run their offense. But what does that tell you? I know we talked about it, but what does that tell you about the keys to beating TCU this week?
Yeah, I think sort of as we've gone through this, the UCF secondary, again, I think is going to be tested in this football game by the TCU throwing game because that is their strength. I mean, you mentioned it, and it's not a good sign, I think, when you go against a team like Long Island and you come out there with only 3.4 yards per carry. I think that's why there's an emphasis, and Sonny Dykes mentioning it, that they have to do a better job of opening up lanes for some of these guys to run through. I don't think their offensive line has done a good enough job of that. But on the flip side, like I had mentioned, they're doing a really good job of protecting Josh Hoover. I don't think he's been sacked once so far through these 2 games. Some other interesting keys that interesting notes that I found here, and against Long Island in particular, 4 for 11 on third down. So, and didn't seem like they did well on the money downs there. I think they were 7 or 8 for 15 against Stanford. So almost a 50% conversion rate there. 13 penalties for 2 games through 2 games. So not the most clean showing in those departments. And I think in games like these, I think all those little things they matter. They become big things. And so obviously UCF, every team says they want to be the most disciplined team, and that's how you got to win football games. But, I think you contrast that to UCF only taking, a few penalties in the first game, and then last week, 6 penalties, yes, but 4 of them all came on one drive, and that was the first one. The rest of the game, they really played pretty clean football. So I think these things are all going to end up mattering in the outcome of this game.
Yeah, it is. There's a couple more. Again, these really don't matter. TCU's got the 14th overall total defense. Again, you can't really take much from these, but there are the nuggets like UCF's number 1 in rushing offense, stuff like that. And red zone offense, I found this interesting. Again, UCF's 83rd, TCU's 46th, so it doesn't really matter. UCF has scored 10 times out of 12 red zone attempts. And I think 8 of those were rushing touchdowns, and the other 2 were field goals. TCU has scored 11 out of the 12. And I think 6 of them were through the air, 4 of them were on the ground, and then 1 of them was a field goal. So it doesn't tell you a whole lot, but it like bend don't break. There are the instances where you can, as UCF, they'd get into the red zone. This is UCF's defense for a while. Get into the red zone and then hold them to a field goal. I think on the road, you saw it against Texas Tech last year, which I'll bring up in a second, but if they get into the red zone area, you need to be able to hold them to field goals. Now, it's easier said than done against an offense like this, and I know that's, wow, Sean, you're thinking so smart. Hold them to field goals and you get touchdowns and you win. Yes, but I think with a team like this, especially on the road where you're going into a hostile environment, your defense needs to show up big time. And this is the perfect test for this defense to say, or have you arrived? Are you actually them? Are you going to be the defense that we can all watch and be like, this defense can hold some of the top offenses this year? If you're going to struggle against TCU, though a good offense, you're going to go into week 5 against Colorado and struggle. You're going to go up in Ames, Iowa and struggle. You're going to go up against Arizona and struggle. So this is the first big test against a really solid offense to say, okay, we're here. He's only got sacked once. So listen, UCF has 1 sack on the year or something like that. So or a couple. So pressure is going to be huge. But I think we're ready for predictions. Or do you kind of have yours in your head? Oh, kicker. Do you want me to mention the kicker? I can mention the kicker during my prediction, though. I can mention.
You mentioned it during the prediction. Okay. How about you go first? Because I'm curious to see what you have, because I'm sort of like developing two different ways to look at this. So I want to hear what you have first.
So here's my spiel. Definitely a toss-up game. We don't know what TCU is. We don't know what UCF is. You kind of got a little bit of a taste of TCU because they did play a Power 4 opponent. You can take things from the UCF victories, but at the end of the day, they played nobody. We've seen them play nobody in years past, and then we get all excited, and then we see them play a real team, and they struggle. I think this team is a little different. I don't think KJ is going to be maybe as rattled on the road. He's played in much tougher atmospheres than this. Our guys got a lot of experience last year playing in environments like this. Sold out crowd. It's going to be a close game. And as a UCF fan, you can be nervous about that, but don't be naive to think that UCF is going to go in and blow them out by 28. It very well could happen. I'm not saying it won't. But Big 12 games this year are going to be dogfights, just like they were last year. And UCF on the road last year, the only road game they won against a Big 12 opponent was Cincinnati. And let's be real here, Cincinnati versus UCF last year was basically an American battle. You played at Cincinnati before, you beat them, and there were some close road games. There were some close road games against Oklahoma. There was a close road game against Texas Tech. But then you had some blowouts. Kansas State I wouldn't consider a blowout, but it wasn't close at the end. Kansas, you got smacked. So when I'm looking at this matchup, I think it is the same for both teams. I think both teams are thinking the exact same way of importance, level of importance, how much they need it, because I do ultimately think, me and Nick have been saying it, this defines how your season goes. Now, granted, UCF could go lose 4 straight after this, and we're all talking like, wow, that TCU win didn't mean anything. I think it's more of a mindset. You win this game, you go into the bye week 3-0 with the matchup against Colorado, you get a week to prepare, and your entire season is ahead of you. You're probably ranked after this game, potentially. Not saying anything, it all matters how UCF plays. I think this is a 3-point game. And I think most people are going to have it as a 3-point game. I'm going to say 31-28 UCF. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is, again, I have no bias on that if this guy's going to miss a kick or not. Their kicker, Kyle Lemmerman, he's 10 for 10 on extra points, but he is 3 for 5 on field goals. And the 2 that he's missed, one was from the 30-39 range, and one was from the 40-49 range. And he's missed a kick in both games. He missed a 40-49 yarder against Long Island. He missed a 30-39 yarder against Stanford. I don't know about you, Nick, but I remember when Colton was dealing with his trouble last season, we had no confidence in trotting a kicker out there to kick any type of field goal. We're like, just go for it. So if I'm TCU and the game is tight and you need a field goal, a guy that's gone 3 for 5 in the first 2 games, maybe he's not somebody that I necessarily have all the trust in. So he can make them. I'm saying right now I believe in Colton Boomer a little bit more, and it's a road game, so it's a toss-up. So I'm going UCF 31, TCU 28.
Well, Lemmerman, he is a freshman, but I think he was the highest-rated kicker in the country.
See, I didn't know that. I just looked at the stats from this season. I don't look at star rankings. But that matters, I guess.
Well,
it matters until you get on the field, and then stuff happens.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't really factor kicking into much of this today. But
with a toss-up game, you never.
So it was a toss-up game, and it was a toss-up in my head of where I was going with this score prediction, because part of me really, not to overreact after the first two games, but part of me is really, really, I feel better about UCF than maybe I thought I did, if that makes sense. And part of me wants to say they're gonna roll into on the road and they're gonna win by 2 scores plus, because that's where I was initially thinking as we sort of talked it through and everything. And I was looking at ways you can beat TCU. I think they're very vulnerable on the outside if UCF can develop their passing offense even more. I think there's some big opportunities for Kobe to have a really strong day. But I'm going to play it a little bit more conservative. I'm almost near you. I'm going 37-28 UCF. So I'm giving them an extra score in this game, essentially. 37-28. But when I was crafting this, I initially had them at 43. So I brought it down.
I hope your score is the right one, because that caused a little less stress on our part and a lot of happiness for 2 weeks. Because if UCF goes in there and, to your score, beats them by a little more than a touchdown, I don't know why, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I feel like the scenario of UCF potentially being 6-0 going into Ames on October 19th it's there. Oh, you just jinxed us.
I'm not
jinxed it.
I don't buy into any of that. I'm just
You're
a
taking
guy.
The Sean Green score approach.
I'm not. I'm just a guy talking, but I know I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself, but just saying, that scenario is out there, because I think we've already seen Colorado looks like a worse version of what they were last year. Florida is Florida, and Cincinnati is, as we expected. So again, you got to get through this one first. But all I'm saying is that exists, but I think it's a chance for them to really go and put a statement out there this week. And but I'll still play it conservative and go 37-28.
What's crazy is, I think if fans of this pod went back and went through all of our score predictions, I think I had UCF almost favored by more in every single game compared to you. And it is completely flipped this year, which is interesting. I think you've been way more confident every single week than I have.
Well, I think it's because the UCF defense, I think there's been enough improvement there from them that tells me that they can be a much better team. And I don't really worry much about the offense. Even with KJ, he's got to get better. We all know that. We've talked about it. But I know they can put yards up on any team. And it's as long as they can continue to turn those into touchdowns, I feel really confident about this team. Because I feel very confident about the defense and the speed that they have put out there this year. And the fact that it looks like they've hit on most of those transfers.
I'll say this, regardless of margin of victory, or I'm not going to say defeat, if UCF wins by a point or 7 points or 14 or however many, if the defense shows up and plays the way the Nick's saying and how they've played the last 2 weeks, I think you'll have a Sean Green come on a show and be very optimistic about what Nick kind of said about the potential of going 6-0 into Ames. Not saying it'll happen, because we know crazier things have happened. But this,
I was going to say, they could go out and lose this weekend, then I look like a fool, and then I'm mad at myself because I never like to get ahead. I never like to make those sort of statements, but here I am. I don't know what's gotten into me. I've turned into you a little bit.
It's literally, it's a little scary. You have turned into me a little bit. But I think, I'll close with this. I think we're saying this, and to TCU fans listening, I guarantee you they're saying the exact same thing. I don't think there is I think Sonny Dykes said to the common football watcher or whatever, these two teams are very similar.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think TCU, people that follow TCU, are fans of TCU, are saying the exact same things we're saying, and then vice versa. I think we both know that these two teams are dangerous, You can't go in assuming you're just this way better team than the other. I think whoever wins this game is setting themselves up for a really good year. I think the person that loses this game isn't necessarily setting themselves up for a bad year, but there's definitely going to be doubt. A lot of doubt heading into the weeks ahead. Because we get a little bit of a bye week. TCU has to go to SMU, which I don't think they're going to have a problem after us. But we get a week to stew and say, how good of a team is this? They have to pack up their bags and play the next week. So for UCF and for our sake, hopefully our eye test is right a little bit and they can go into Fort Worth with a W. Nick, final thoughts before we close out this one.
Should be fun. I know you're handling the watch along. I might join you on that on Saturday night. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, everybody enjoy your week and enjoy your college football Saturday because we're already at the third one of the year. It's going to be gone before we know it, but let's not talk like that.
Yeah, early, but let's not think about the end. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, like Nick said, we are doing a live watch along for this game. Subscribe to the channel. I might be bringing some of you guys on watching live to give your guys' thoughts. Who knows what can happen? The first time I did it, it was the Kansas game, and that was a blowout, and I needed to talk to people. So definitely tune in. Should be a good fun time, and hopefully we can come out with a W. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, comment, share. Do all that you do. We greatly appreciate it. We will be dropping a pod immediately after the game. Probably whenever the game ends, we'll record the pod and drop it immediately. So be on the lookout for that as well. All right, everybody. Let's go beat TCU. Let's go 3-0. This has been Charge On, presented by Bet Online. We will see you after the game.